Evan, a student at a small university, was happy to find an inexpensive apartment close to campus. The building where the apartment was located was old and a little run down, with peeling paint and rusty fire escapes. But that didn't bother him. The main thing was the affordability and proximity to school. The apartment was small, with high ceilings and creaky wooden floors. Evan quickly got used to the slight sound of the wind blowing through the hallways and the faint cracking of the pipes, which seemed normal for such a building. But one night, he heard something strange. Around 2 in the morning, when he was already falling asleep, a creaking sound came from the wall next to his bed. It was not the usual sound of an old house, but something else, like someone slowly walking around the next room. Neighbors, Evan thought, not paying attention to it, and tried to sleep. But the next night, the creaking came again, and this time it was more rhythmic, as if the footsteps were getting closer, and then stopping at the wall itself. Evan sat up in bed, trying to listen. The wall was cold to the touch, and the sound seemed to be coming from deep within. But there couldn't be neighbors behind it. Behind that wall was an empty room that the owner of the building used as a warehouse. Evan felt uneasy, but he convinced himself that it was just a play of sounds in the old house. However, on the third night, he realized that he was wrong. On the third day, Evan decided to check who could be the source of the sounds. In the morning, he knocked on the next door, but no one answered. He asked the old concierge on the first floor, hoping to get an answer. "Does someone live there?" Evan asked, trying to sound calm. The old man looked at him suspiciously. No one. This room has been locked for years. The owner has the key, and no one has entered it." But I hear sounds. At night, like someone is walking around?" Evan continued, feeling anxiety begin to grow inside. The concierge just shrugged. "An old house, young man, the walls can creak, the wind can make noise, you know how it is." Evan did not argue, but something in the old man's tone made him doubt. That night, he decided to stay alert. When the clock struck midnight, everything was quiet. But soon, as before, a familiar creaking sound was heard. This time the sound was louder, clearer. The steps were coming from behind the wall, as if someone was carefully moving around the room. Evan felt a chill run down his spine. He approached the wall, put his ear to it, and froze. Now the steps were accompanied by a whisper, muffled, barely audible, as if the words were coming from far away. "I don't care for it that much," he whispered to himself. He wanted to move away, but suddenly the light in the room flickered, and a shadow flashed in the corner of his vision. Evan turned around, thinking that he imagined it, but no. On the wall, in the very place from which the sounds came, a dark figure was slowly emerging. It did not move, but its outlines were becoming clearer. The figure looked tall, its head slightly tilted, and its arms were stretched out, as if it were standing and watching Evan. He froze, unable to tear his eyes away. The shadow began to slowly separate from the wall, its silhouette becoming three-dimensional, and the air in the room grew colder. Evan stepped back, feeling his legs buckle. The figure took a step forward, and a long creaking sound came from the wall, as if the building itself was resisting its exit. Evan stood there, frozen, watching as the figure emerged from the wall entirely. It moved slowly, but with a terrifying determination. He could see it clearly now, a black, shapeless silhouette that seemed to be absorbing the light around it. The cold was unbearable, and his own breath was turning to steam. The air seemed to be pressurized, pressing him to the floor. Evan backed away, but the figure moved behind him as if it knew his every step. Suddenly, the lights in the room went out. He thought he was completely alone, but then he heard a familiar sound. A creak. It was no longer coming from the wall, but from the direction of his own bed. With trembling hands, he turned on the flashlight on his phone and illuminated the room. Where the bed should have been, there stood his roommate. The figure seemed more substantial now, its outlines sharpened, and it began to resemble Evan himself. "No, it can't be," he whispered, stepping back. He felt his back hit a cold, hard surface. Turning around, Evan realized he was standing in front of the same wall, but it wasn't normal anymore. The wall was pulsating, as if alive, and strange patterns covered its surface, as if it were opening its mouth, ready to swallow him. Hands reached out from the darkness towards him. Evan screamed, but the sound disappeared the moment the walls closed. The next morning, the concierge noticed that the door to Evan's apartment was ajar. When he entered, he found that the room looked different. Its furnishings seemed alien. The air was cold, and the bed was neatly made. Only one oddity caught his attention. The wall at the head of the bed was now smooth, devoid of any cracks that had been there before. But if you looked long enough, you could see the faint outline of a face, as if someone was watching from inside. Evan was gone, but his apartment wasn't empty anymore. When new tenants moved in a few weeks later, they started hearing sounds, creaking footsteps, quiet whispers, and if you lingered in the silence for too long, you could feel like someone was watching you from the wall.